What is the real significance of the 4th of July? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. That's my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners as always.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you for your great support of our foundation. So, Richard, celebrating the 4th of July, the Declaration of Independence. We do it every year. We have for the whole 35 years of FFF's existence, but it's always important to return to first principles. And one of the first principles in terms of the founding of this country and libertarian principles is the Declaration of Independence. And so I think we ought to discuss it again. So I'll start out, give a little pitch here, and then I'll toss the baton over to you. I've always felt that the real significance of the 4th of July is not the military battles that took place between the English colonists and the English troops. The real significance of the 4th of July is what was written in that Declaration of Independence. It was a revolutionary construct there in that document that Jefferson wrote, Thomas Jefferson. It shocked the world. We take it for granted in this country. I would venture to say that the Declaration is sort of ho hum. But on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration shocked the world, absolutely shocked the world. Why is that? Well, for centuries, for as long as man has been existing, it was always assumed that government controlled the citizenry and that the role of the citizenry was to serve the king, to serve the sovereign. The king was the master and the regime was the master. The people were the serfs, they were the servants. And that was the mindset. And so if the king wanted to seize your property, call it taxation or whatever, nobody questioned that. That's the king's prerogative. If the king decided to arrest you, put you in the Tower of London, torture you, execute you, well, that's just the way things go. That was his prerogative. That was the mindset of all of humanity. That of course government can control, for example, economic activity. There were laws in the Middle Ages and so forth, anti-speculation laws, where the king would prohibit speculators from buying up farmers' crops and selling them in the inner city for a profit. Nobody questioned this. This is what governments do. They regulate, they manage people's affairs, they take care of the citizenry. So all of a sudden, here comes Jefferson and says, oh no, on the contrary, people are endowed with certain fundamental, inherent, God-given rights that pre-exist government. They're independent of the government. They don't come from the government. And so people don't need to be grateful. They don't need to bow before the king. The king cannot infringe on these fundamental rights. And he says, in fact, it's the purpose of government to protect the exercise of these rights. And that's the only purpose of government, is to protect these rights that pre-exist government. So Jefferson was saying, it's the government who's the servant. It's the people who are the masters. That was a stunner. I mean, that shocked the world. It shocked rulers all over across the earth. They were terrified that people might really start believing this. And so what are these rights? Well, Jefferson talks in terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he says all people are endowed with these rights. It's not just Americans. Well, of course, these were English people we're talking about. I think we should keep in mind that the colonists were English. They were rebelling against their own government. It wasn't like fighting a foreign government. They were essentially seceding from the British Empire. And so the pursuit of happiness adheres to everybody, not just English citizens or American citizens or whatever. You have a right to pursue happiness. That is a fundamental, natural, God-given right that exists independent of the government. It doesn't come from the Constitution. We've often heard, oh, let me read you your constitutional rights. No, the Constitution doesn't give rights. Rights pre-exist the Constitution. They pre-exist the government. And then the liberty, which encompasses all aspects of liberty, liberty of contract, liberty of expression, freedom of association, economic liberty. And then life, it's not just life. We're talking about the right to sustain your life through labor, through trade with others, freedom of trade. Uh, so that to me is the real significance of the Declaration of Independence. It's that revolutionary concept that Jefferson observed and pointed out for the whole world to be aware of. What do you think, Richard?
I give my allegiance to King George III. Oh, no, wait. That was the other podcast I was going to do. No. Uh, Most Americans, when they were going to school, I don't even know if kids learn it anymore, those famous words that you alluded to, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as Jefferson goes on, governments are formed to secure these rights. And if the government fails to do so after attempt for redress, the people have a right to change that government to one that will provide it. This was revolutionary, as you're saying, that the purpose of government is to secure and protect the rights of individuals, not for individuals to serve the government. And the other aspect of this is that those lines with which Jefferson, near the beginning of the Declaration, hails the underlying philosophical principles, is followed by the enumerated grievances of the colonists. It's not a long document. It's one page, that famous parchment page with all those signatures at the bottom, with John Hancock's being the largest. But what are these enumerated grievances? And the large majority of them concern economic freedom, the burden of taxation, the regulation and prohibition on commerce, trade, manufacturing, both among the colonies and between the colonies and the rest of the world, including the British Empire. That the king has crushed the people with a swarm of bureaucrats eating out their innards. I forget the exact phrase, but that's what it amounts to.
Their substance.
Substance, thank you. Uh, and so basically, the colonists are complaining about an oppressive government that is denying their fundamental liberties, of which they are most cogently aware of being their economic freedom, the right to freely produce, the right to freely follow an occupation, the right to freely enter into exchanges, transactions, business arrangements with other colonists as well as the rest of the world. And that they're basically calling for both personal freedom, political freedom, that is separation and forming of their own representative government, and economic liberty, that it is not the duty, responsibility, or the right power of government to manage the economic affairs of the people under that government. They are to be protected in their property, their freedom of association, contracts they may have entered into. But beyond that, the state should have no involvement. If there's not force or fraud, it is not the duty, responsibility, or the role of the government to interfere with this. That was revolutionary. That was revolutionary because everywhere in Europe and the empires that the European major powers already had, such as the British Empire, the French Empire, there was virtually nothing in the arena of economic affairs that the respective governments did not presume the right and responsibility to control and regulate, what they called mercantilism, which is merely the 18th century version of government central planning. What could be produced, where it could be produced, who could do the producing, at what prices it might be sold, what wages could be paid, uh, what goods may be imported, what goods were to be exported. All of these were considered essential to be in the power and the hands of the government, of whose highest authority was the king. And everyone was merely to be an obedient servant to do what the king and his agents commanded and insisted upon, under threat of imprisonment, or, execution in many cases, certainly prosecution and loss of one's monetary wealth. That is what the government was doing. And the colonists said, no, That is not the role. And that shot that was heard around the world, which relates to the colonists opposing the British troops at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, that this was a shot that heard around the world because it was questioning the right of governments to control the liberty and the freedom and the lives of each and every human being. Now, it took a little while for that shot around the world to be heard because I know it's hard to believe, but there was no internet, there was no CNN, no headline, alert news on a Fox network. But within a short time of the discovery that these people were resisting the British Crown, and then in July of the next year, 1776, the issuance of this Declaration of Independence by representatives of the rebelling colonies, that was a change in the very way the political thinking of the world was affected, and it has remained so. There's very little that is in the form of freedom anywhere, whether the freedom is wide, whether the freedom is narrow, that hasn't had its germ of origin in that Declaration of Independence. That next year will be 250 years of anniversary since it occurred, a, a quarter of 1,000 years, or a quarter of a millennium since that shot was heard around the world and that declaration was released. The tragedy, as I see it, and I know you'll want to comment on this too, the tragedy, as I see it, is how few of our fellow citizens in the United States even know what the 4th of July as a holiday is about. They picnic out, they grill their brats and sausages, they play games in the park or at the beach, they watch a sports game on TV, and have a delightful day. But why are you celebrating it? What makes it so important? And unfortunately, most Americans have very little appreciation, and in many cases, not even understanding of the momentous importance of that date and what it has meant in the history of the world.
Well, you bring up a lot of good points. Your point about economic liberty in the Declaration is a great point. I think it's also worth mentioning that one of the reasons for the break with the country, with the regime, the English regime, was immigration controls. That they cite that Jefferson cites that the King George has restricted migration into the colonies.
Yes.
And the other thing that I think should be mentioned is the other thing that happened in 1776, which dovetailed perfectly in with Jefferson's construct, and that's Adam Smith's publication of his great book, The Wealth of Nations, where he addresses this point of economic liberty. And he says, you know, there's a reason why nations have remained poor throughout the world, throughout history. It's because government is involved in economic activity, many times intended to help the people. And that if you really want to get wealthy in a society, stop the government from doing that. This is where the concept of free enterprise originated. Enterprise that's free of government control or management. That was as shocking a notion as the ideas that Jefferson was presenting. But those two matters, and the Wealth of Nations became a bestseller in the colonies. So from 1776 all the way up to, I guess it was 1791, when the Constitution calls into existence the federal government, they were operating under the Articles of Confederation. And I think it's worth noting about the Articles is the federal government, and there was a federal government for more than 10 years, was not given the power to tax. That's how they felt about government. They wanted weak government. They didn't want a strong government. They figured we'll have a stronger nation if we have a weaker government. And so by the time the Constitution calls into existence the federal government, I think it has to be read in conjunction with the Wealth of Nations and the Declaration of Independence. Because if you exclude slavery, which obviously was a horrific violation of these principles, they bring into existence the most unusual society in history, Richard. I mean, this is another shocker for the world. But by the time, let's say, 1890 arrives, imagine This is a society that is unlike any society that has ever existed. It's like this little tiny light. You've got all this darkness throughout the centuries, but this one tiny little period of light of 100 years here, where you've got no income tax, no IRS, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare state, national security state, Pentagon, CIA, NSA, FBI, drug laws, DEA, all the departments, labor, agriculture, energy, homeland security, education, uh, all the rest of those, paper money, no paper money. They had gold and silver coins as the official money, no Federal Reserve, no coups, foreign wars. I mean, there was exceptions like the Spanish-American War, but that was what the statists were bringing about. The statists were already attacking in the late 1800s. You got the Sherman Antitrust Law in 1890, but this was not because of these ideas of Jefferson and Smith. It was despite those ideas. The statists were starting to make inroads. No minimum wage laws during that period of time. It's the most remarkable experiment that has ever been done. And what was the result of this? Well, only the most prosperous period in the history of man, no immigration controls to speak of. The first immigration control law was in the late 1870s, the Page Act, which excluded Chinese women, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, they excluded all Chinese. But other than that, 97% of immigrants were being let in with the Ellis Island system. It was incredible and the most prosperous period and the most charitable nation. When people were free to accumulate wealth, they gave a lot of it away. John D. Rockefeller, who's reviled as a robber baron, gave away $500 million and not to get an income tax deduction because there was no income tax. But this is how the museums and the hospitals and the libraries, opera houses, they all got built just voluntarily. And unfortunately, later generations of Americans got sucked in with the allure of socialism and interventionism and militarism, and here we are today.
Well, the most frustrating part, and I think all friends of freedom must be concerned about it, is that the governmental school system and its monopoly over what is taught and how it's taught uh, brings about a situation in which generations go by now who have no understanding of, as you were saying, that first 100 years of the United States after the setting up, let's say, of the Constitution or the Declaration, those last decades of the 19th century. They define it as a period in which workers were exploited by evil capitalist employers, that every white person was a racist. Obviously, they have no knowledge of the abolition movement in which both white men and women in the North devoted time, effort, and personal risk of their life and their liberty uh, to fight against slavery and to run the risk of imprisonment by participating in the Underground Railroad to help runaway slaves get to Canada. But the fact is that this is unknown. That the idea that there was a huge arena, as you were suggesting, of private charity and voluntary association, what is often referred to as the institutions of civil society, that is outside of the government, by which all of the problems that are considered of social importance today, retirement, health care, disability, housing, all of these were taken care of by private association and charities. I would just mention that when the famous French social philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1830s, spent here a good period of time, and then returned to France and wrote his famous book, Democracy in America, he has a section in volume 2 of it in which he draws attention to both Frenchmen and others in Europe to this unique establishment in America of voluntary association. That whenever people believe that there is a social problem or social difficulty, they get together. They form private clubs, charities, philanthropic organizations, educational institutions for great and small issues. And remember, people got around on horses back then, or on a river on a boat, and yet people would communicate through the mail. And these isolated people in what was then the United States would form countrywide associations with chapters in these different parts of the United States, all serving these purposes with no government funding, no government regulation, no government approval, no government distribution of tax money. This was the private sector, all at work because people took responsibility and liberty for their own affairs and those of their communities and beyond that that they considered important, often religious based. But that is what made America great, of which people found marvelous and a marvel in itself. And that has all gone down an Orwellian memory hole because of the monopoly educational system in which that knowledge and that alternative interpretive understanding of America's first century is totally lost. It's viewed as evil and oppressive and exploitive and terrible until daddy government came, first with Woodrow Wilson and then Franklin Roosevelt, capping off with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and made America beautiful and safe and secure, but which could never have occurred without Father Government taking care of us.
Well, the interesting aspect of what you're talking about is that the people that lived, let's say in the late 1800s, they celebrated the 4th of July too. And but what they were celebrating, this is what's so fascinating, is totally different from what today's Americans celebrate on the 4th of July. I mean, today's Americans celebrate the fact that they live under a system that's a welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, income tax, IRS, Federal Reserve, paper money, foreign wars, national security state, on and on. That's their concept of freedom. I think if you did a survey of the American people, I'm willing to bet the vast majority, 70 or 80% would say, yeah, of course we live in a free society. And they have no conception that the system that they live under is totally opposite from the system that people in the late 1800s were living under. And how can two opposites both be freedom? It's either one or the other. And I think that today's Americans really do embody the words of Johann Goethe. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. I think that really captures the plight of the American people of our time. You mentioned public schooling. I think one of the big purposes of public government schooling is to indoctrinate people into truly believing they're free when they live under a massive, all powerful government. Because what better slave than the slave who thinks he's free? He has no incentive to break his chains because he doesn't see any chains. And I think that's one of the real tragedies of our time. It'd be one thing if people knew they weren't free. They said, okay, we're living under socialism, but we choose socialism, or we choose to surrender our liberties to be kept safe from the communists and the terrorists and the drug dealers and the so forth. But no, Richard, thank you for your service. I mean, I think when people say that to these troops that are invading and other lands and wars of aggression, undeclared wars, and I think they truly believe that they live in a free society if the troops are protecting their freedom. Let me just say one more thing. You know that song by Lee Greenwood that goes like, "Thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free." I, I think there's a lot of people who sing that in very good faith, including Lee Greenwood.
They do. This it this element. See, this element is perhaps the hardest thing to break because if people don't see that there is a problem, that the system is the government is the problem rather than the solution, it's difficult to change them. Now, as you know, I traveled in the Soviet Union in its last years before its collapse, and what starkly stood out there is that most people might have been passive. I mean, nobody wants to be picked up by the KGB because that ruins your day, obviously. But uh, almost everyone in the Soviet Union understood that the system was corrupt, violent, uh, was used to serve a clique in the Communist Party and within the bureaucracy, that they did not have the same civil liberties as people in the West. They certainly did not have the same access to consumer goods and in consumer choice that people had in the West. They did not have the civil liberties that people had in the West. Read what you want, watch what you want, say what you want, and not have to worry about being picked up and arrested and disappearing. People understood that the system they lived under was unfreedom. And that made it easy for eventually the system to implode. Uh, it's harder for a system to implode when people believe that what they have is freedom. Now, during Stalin's time in the 1930s, besides, in spite of his oppressiveness, the purges, the famine in Ukraine, and all that stuff, there was a large segment of the population who believed what the government said. They're building socialism. Oh, mistakes are made, but there are these enemies around the world, and there's spies and their wreckers are trying to do anything here to prevent our achievement of the wonderful post-scarcity world of communism that we're trying to build. And there were a lot of people who believe this. And when you have a sufficient number of people to believe it, then nothing's going to change. One of the famous comments that David Hume makes, the famous British philosopher of the 1700s, a friend of Adam Smith's, was that government rules by opinion. The government is always a minority of people. There's the government, there's the soldiers, the bureaucracy, but as a percentage of the overall population, they're a small minority. So how can a minority rule over majority when it is plundering and oppressing and interfering and prohibiting and all the other business, giving privileges and favors to some at the expense of others? And Hume's argue is that it's as long as the people believe that the system that they're living under is right and just, that they have been persuaded that this is the way the world should be and they should like it. But until people change that, opinion changes against the justifications or rationales and ideological underlying linchpins of the system, it is very difficult to change. Only at that point do the people turn against the system, even if it's only within themselves. I don't believe anything the government tells me. I always have doubts about what they say, how things are working and what they're doing and why. Even if it's only within the individual. I'm not talking about a protest and standing out in front of Red Square facing, Soviet troops or something. It's when enough people inside say, I know it's bankrupt, I know it's wrong, I know it's corrupt, and I refuse to believe what they tell me. And while I externally have to play along with the game, inside I reject it. Now, until that point is reached, it's hard to have a major radical change in the society.
That's a great point. And in order to reach that point, people have to abandon this notion that we are the government. I
Yes.
mean, there's that mindset of, oh, the government is us. If you want to change the system, just vote better, vote for better people to get into public office. Uh, well, we are not the government. We're talking about two separate and distinct entities here. We're talking about the American people, the nation, and the government. And until people understand that, it's very difficult for them to get to the point you're talking about. But the Bill of Rights is a proof of that. The Bill of Rights doesn't give us rights. It protects the nation from the federal government, from federal officials,
Mhm.
prohibiting them from destroying freedom of speech and freedom of the press and gun rights. And if they target us, they have to follow certain procedural protections. And then there's a Ninth Amendment that says, hey, just because we've enumerated some rights in here doesn't mean that these are the only rights there are. Once
Yeah.
people get that mindset that we are separate and apart from the government, and the government is a grave threat to our freedom and well being, and
Mhm.
is destroying freedom here and destroying the freedom there and destroying freedom there, that's an obstacle that we need to overcome here.
Mhm. See, what the extreme form of finally saying, no, I don't view myself as part of the government is and you see it on television shows, police shows, FBI shows, all this stuff. Who is the person that they think is the worst person? Uh, the threat, the fringe wacko, the guy who says, I do not recognize your authority over me. Oh, the wacko nut. Right? Because that person is saying, I don't believe that I'm you. You are separate from me, and I view you as my oppressor. See, that's why that person on these shows it's always viewed as the most dangerous or wacko person that should not be taken seriously. What do you mean you don't recognize it? It's the government. It's your government. We're your servants. How come you refuse to accept and recognize our authority? See, that's what happened in the Soviet Union. Nobody was going to stand up in Red Square and say, I don't recognize the authority because the consequence. But inside, a significant number of people said, I don't recognize their authority. That's why I deal in the black market. That's why I listen to news that's forbidden, because I want to hear the truth rather than the propaganda pablum that the Kremlin tries to feed me. And that's the kind of change that has to occur.
Well, I think we might be getting closer to that. I think there's a lot more people now than there were when we started the Future of Freedom Foundation that are starting to realize that. That's a
I
good thing.
like to think so. I mean, by now there's got to be more than just you and me.
One would hope so. All right. On that bright note, we'll wrap things up. Want to wish you all a very happy Fourth and have a great time. And Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in, and thanks for your great support of FFF.
Happy 4th of July.